I'd never volunteered on Thanksgiving before, but this year, with my family spread across the country and unable to gather, I decided to spend the day helping out at a local food kitchen. The place was a small, bustling operation set up in an old church basement, and the staff there welcomed me warmly, showing me the ropes and assigning me to serve plates to the guests who came in for the holiday meal. It felt good to be part of something, and the cheerful chaos of it all helped to ease the loneliness that had been hanging over me. I served turkey and mashed potatoes, ladling gravy over everything with a smile and a nod to each guest. The atmosphere was lively, with kids laughing and people chatting over their food. The scent of cinnamon and roasting vegetables filled the room, giving it that cozy holiday feeling. I just settled into the rhythm of it when I noticed him, a man who seemed out of place among the guests. He sat alone at a table in the corner, his eyes scanning the room with a cold intensity. His face was thin and pale, and his clothes looked too new for someone who'd been struggling. Unlike the others who chatted and relaxed, he seemed tense, his gaze darting around every few seconds. Every so often, he'd pull his chair out slightly to peer down the hallway toward the exit, as if checking to make sure it was still there. Something about him set me on edge, but I told myself he was probably just shy or nervous. Plenty of people feel uncomfortable in crowds. Still, as I continued serving, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off about him. He barely touched his food, just pushed it around on the plate while his eyes stayed locked on the exit. My unease grew when one of the regular volunteers, a woman named Linda, came up beside me to refill the mashed potatoes. I gestured toward the man and asked if she knew him, hoping for a little reassurance. Linda glanced over, her smile faltering as she shook her head. She told me she'd never seen him before, adding that she knew most of the people who came here. I tried to brush it off, but the way her gaze lingered on him made my skin prickle. As the afternoon wore on, I kept an eye on him. He'd shift in his seat, sometimes standing up only to sit back down again. Once he even walked over to the coffee station, where he poured himself a cup but didn't drink it, just held it while he paced near the entrance. At one point he muttered something under his breath, his expression grim, like he was having an argument with himself. The other volunteers noticed him too, their faces reflecting the same nervous curiosity I felt. Finally, it was almost time to wrap up the meal. People started saying their goodbyes, thanking us as they headed out. But the man in the corner didn't move. Instead, he sat, eyes locked on a group of kids playing near the door, his expression shifting to something darker, almost angry. I felt a rush of dread. Without thinking, I made my way over to him, determined to figure out what was going on. I asked him if I could get him anything else, trying to keep my voice light. He looked up at me, his eyes flat and cold. For a long moment he didn't say anything, just stared at me like I'd interrupted something important. Then, in a low voice, he asked if it was safe here. The question took me off guard. I told him it was, of course, and asked if he was all right, but he didn't respond. Instead, he muttered that they always think they're safe, but no one's safe. Not really, not even here. A chill went down my spine, but before I could press him further, he got up and walked toward the door, his pace slow and deliberate. Just as he reached the exit, he stopped, turned around, and stared back at the room, his eyes lingering on the families gathered at the tables. I was about to call for one of the other volunteers when he finally stepped outside, disappearing into the darkening evening. I tried to shake off the encounter, telling myself he was just an odd man, someone with troubles of his own. But a lingering unease stayed with me, and I couldn't stop glancing at the door, half expecting him to come back in. When I mentioned the incident to Linda, she looked concerned but shrugged it off, saying we see all kinds here. The evening rushed past and things started to quiet down. A few volunteers began cleaning up, stacking chairs and wiping down tables. Just as I started gathering empty plates, I heard a loud, sudden crash from outside. Everyone froze, the sound reverberating through the room. I exchanged a look with Linda, and we both headed toward the door to see what had happened. When we stepped outside, we saw a shattered glass bottle on the ground, and that same man standing a few yards away, breathing heavily. His hands were clenched into fists, and his gaze was wild, darting between the volunteers who had gathered to supper. A wave of fear swept over me as I realized he was staring directly at me, his expression twisted with anger. He hissed that we thought we were safe in there, his voice filled with a venom that sent a shiver down my spine. He said we were all thinking nothing bad could happen to us. Linda stepped forward, her voice steady as she told him to leave or she'd call the police. For a moment he just glared at her, the rage in his eyes making me take a step back. Then, without another word, he turned and walked off into the shadows, disappearing down the street. The volunteers exchanged uneasy glances, and Linda finally broke the silence, saying we were going to need to keep an eye out for him. She added that he might come back. I nodded, trying to push down the lingering fear that his words had stirred up. As the night went on, I helped finish cleaning up, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, like he was lurking somewhere nearby, waiting for his chance to come back. Every time the door creaked or a shadow moved outside, my heart skipped a beat, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder. By the time we locked up, everyone was quiet, casting nervous looks at the darkened streets around the church. I said my goodbyes quickly, eager to get home and shake off the tension that clung to me. As I walked to my car, I felt the weight of his words settle over me. The echo of his anger and the look in his eyes burned into my memory. Driving home, I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see him following me, but the roads were empty. When I finally got home, I locked the doors, something I rarely did, and turned on all the lights. For the first time in a long time, I felt genuinely afraid, the memory of his cold stare still fresh in my mind. The next day I called Linda to check in, and she told me the police had been notified. They hadn't found him, but they promised to keep an eye on the area. Linda said she hoped he was just passing through, someone lost and troubled. I wanted to believe that, but something told me I'd be keeping my doors locked for a long time. It was a Thanksgiving I wouldn't forget, not because of the meal or the people, but because of the shadow that had lingered in the corner, reminding me that sometimes real danger can be much closer than we think. The first time I invited my family to Thanksgiving at my new place, I had no idea what I was getting myself into. I'd recently bought a cozy little house on the outskirts of town, a fixer-upper that still had its share of creaks and quirks, but I was proud of it, flaws and all. This year I wanted to prove that I could host Thanksgiving and make it memorable. My family arrived in waves, each car filling my driveway with a mixture of laughter and bickering. My mom and dad, carrying trays of her famous stuffing and his smoked turkey, looked around the house, nodding in approval. My older sister Kelly arrived with her 2 kids, who immediately set off running around, exploring every corner. My younger brother Jake, always the last one to show, came with his usual grin, clearly just here for the food and family gossip. Things went well enough at first. The smell of roasting turkey filled the air, and my mom fussed over the side dishes while I checked on dessert. The kids, bored with the adults' conversation, were running in and out of rooms, laughing as they played some sort of hide-and-seek game. I didn't think much of it until my niece came back into the kitchen, a confused look on her face. She tugged at my sleeve and whispered that she'd seen a little boy hiding under the stairs. I laughed and patted her head, telling her she was probably just imagining things. She was at that age where everything was a game, her imagination always running wild. But then my nephew ran in, eyes wide, asking why a kid was hiding in my house. He said he'd tried talking to him, but the boy just stared at him and didn't say a word. My stomach twisted a little, but I brushed it off, telling them it was probably just a trick of the light or a shadow. As the afternoon wore on, strange things started to happen. Plates that I'd set out seemed to move on their own, sliding an inch or two across the table. My dad complained about a draft, saying he could feel cold air even though every window was closed. And my mom kept asking me about the sounds coming from the basement. Sounds like someone walking up and down the stairs. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the turkey and the rest of the meal. But then, while we were all gathered around the table, ready to start eating, my niece screamed. She was staring at the doorway, eyes fixed on something that wasn't there. When I asked her what was wrong, she just pointed, saying the boy was back, staring at us from the hallway. Jake laughed, thinking she was just playing a game, but the look on her face told a different story. She wasn't pretending. She was genuinely scared. My mom tried to comfort her, saying it was just her imagination. But my niece kept insisting, whispering that the boy looked sad, like he wanted something from us. A chill ran down my spine, but I forced a smile, determined to keep the mood light. I made a joke about the Thanksgiving ghost in my new house, trying to laugh it off. My family chuckled nervously, though I could tell everyone felt the tension in the room. As we ate, the kids stayed quiet, their eyes darting around the room as if they were expecting the boy to reappear at any moment. And I started to notice things too. Shadows flickered in the corners of my vision, just out of sight. The air felt colder, and every now and then, I thought I heard the faint sound of footsteps in the hallway, even though we were all sitting at the table. After dinner, I decided to go check the basement, just to ease everyone's nerves. My dad offered to come with me, and we made our way down the creaky stairs, the dim light barely cutting through the shadows. As we reached the bottom, a cold breeze hit us, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. The basement was empty, just boxes and old furniture piled in the corners. But as we turned to go back upstairs, I noticed something strange. On the dusty floor there were small footprints, as if a child had been walking around down there. They led toward the far wall, where an old door stood, locked and unused. I tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. My dad looked at me, his face pale, and suggested we go back upstairs. He was a practical man, not one to believe in ghosts or anything supernatural, but even he seemed unnerved. Back in the kitchen, my mom was whispering with my sister, glancing over at the kids, who were sitting silently on the couch, their faces pale. I told everyone what we'd seen in the basement, trying to keep my voice steady. My mom crossed herself, muttering something about the house's history. She'd always been superstitious, and now she was convinced there was something unsettled in the house. The rest of the evening was tense. The kids refused to go near the hallway, and even the adults seemed jumpy, flinching at every sound. When it was finally time for everyone to leave, I felt a strange sense of relief, like a weight lifting off my shoulders. But as I was cleaning up, I heard a sound that froze me in place. From the hallway came the faint, unmistakable sound of a child's laughter, soft and distant, as if it were coming from another room. I stood there, heart pounding, as the laughter faded away. The house was silent, but the air felt thick, heavy with an unseen presence. I told myself it was just my imagination, just the stress of the evening getting to me. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept hearing faint footsteps, soft whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. And every now and then I thought I saw a small shadow standing in the doorway, watching me with sad, unblinking eyes. Thanksgiving has always been a time for family and friends, a time to gather and give thanks. But now, whenever the holiday comes around, I can't help but think of that boy, the one who still lingers in the shadows of my house, waiting for something I can never give him. Thanksgiving has always been a big deal in my family. We gather at my grandmother's old farmhouse every year, bringing dishes, stories, and laughter that fill every corner. This year, though, felt different. My grandmother, who usually sat by the fireplace telling stories, had passed away last spring. My parents decided to keep up the tradition, saying it's what she would have wanted, so we all returned to her house to celebrate. The farmhouse seemed colder, emptier without her warmth. As I helped my mom set the table, I kept expecting to see my grandmother's chair rocking gently by the fireplace, just like she used to do while waiting for everyone to arrive. But it stood still, casting a shadow that made the room feel hollow. We all gathered around the table, plates piled high, but it was like an invisible weight was pressing down on us. My uncle tried to lighten the mood with a joke, but it fell flat. The silence that followed was heavy, until my little cousin Lily, who was only 6, whispered, Grandma's here." Everyone froze, staring at her. I asked her what she meant, and she pointed to the empty chair by the fireplace. She said she could see Grandma sitting there, smiling at us. My mom chuckled nervously, saying kids have wild imaginations, but there was something in Lily's eyes that unsettled me. She didn't seem like she was making it up. After dinner, we moved to the living room, trying to shake off the somber mood. The house creaked and groaned in the wind, the way it always had, but every noise felt sharper, more alive somehow. I glanced toward my grandmother's chair by the fire, half expecting to see a shadow, a hint of movement. Then, as we were sharing old family stories, Lily looked up suddenly, her face serious. "Grandma says to tell you she's okay," she said, her voice so clear and calm that everyone fell silent. "She says she misses us but wants us to keep laughing and telling stories, and not to worry about her." No one knew what to say. My mom started to cry, and my dad just stared at Lily, who seemed so certain, so matter-of-fact. We all sat there in silence for a moment, feeling like Grandma really was there, just out of sight, watching us and smiling. The rest of the night felt lighter. We shared stories, laughed a little easier, and even my mom seemed at peace. Before we left, I glanced back at the old rocking chair by the fireplace. It was still, bathed in the soft glow of the firelight, but I swear I saw it move just the tiniest bit, as if Grandma was giving us one last wave goodbye. That Thanksgiving was the first one without her, but it didn't feel like she was truly gone. Somehow it felt like she was right there with us, keeping her memory alive with every laugh and every story we shared. Thanksgiving at Aunt Susan's was always a chaotic affair, and that year was no different. She had a big old house on the edge of town, one of those places with creaky wooden floors and high ceilings that seemed to trap every echo and whisper. Family from all over the state crowded in each Thanksgiving, and by the time the turkey hit the table, the place was packed. The family dynamics were always interesting. Aunt Susan was our unofficial family historian, and every year she'd remind us of the ancestors we had who were supposedly connected to the Salem witch trials. She loved the drama of it all, claiming our family had a unique energy because of this mysterious lineage. My cousins and I used to roll our eyes at her stories, but deep down, it gave the holiday a spooky kind of charm. That particular Thanksgiving, Aunt Susan seemed even more animated than usual. She'd redecorated the dining room with some antiques she'd found, including a massive wooden mirror she'd hung at one end of the room. The frame was dark and intricately carved with twisted vines and leaves that seemed to move if you looked at them too long. Aunt Susan said it had been crafted in the early 1800s and claimed it was a perfect addition to honor our family's history as dinner started. We all noticed that the mirror created an odd effect. It reflected almost the entire dining room, but not quite. Certain angles seemed warped, and the lighting looked strange, as if the mirror was capturing something different from what was right in front of us. Uncle Joe joked about it being haunted, and we all laughed, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that crept over me every time I glanced at it. As we were eating, Aunt Susan launched into another of her family history tales. She spoke about a distant relative, Hannah Bellamy, who had lived in Massachusetts in the 1700s. According to family lore, Hannah had been gifted someone who could see things others couldn't. Aunt Susan insisted that Hannah had communicated with spirits and that her sight had led to her being shunned by her community. Halfway through the story, Aunt Susan paused, looking a little lost. She stared into the mirror, her eyes narrowing as if she were seeing something in its depths. My mom asked her if she was okay, and Aunt Susan snapped back to the present, smiling, but she looked rattled. She brushed it off, saying she just thought she saw something move in the mirror. We all exchanged glances, a little spooked but still laughing it off. As the evening wore on, people began noticing odd reflections in the mirror. My cousin Mike swore he saw a shadow standing behind him in the glass, even though no one was there when he turned around. Aunt Susan tried to reassure us, saying it was probably just the flickering candlelight, but her eyes kept darting back to the mirror. When dessert came, Aunt Susan asked us to all share something we were thankful for, and she insisted we face the mirror as we spoke. It felt strange, like we were putting on a show for an invisible audience. When it was my turn, I reluctantly looked at the mirror and said my piece, but I had the unsettling feeling that someone was staring back at me, someone beyond the glass. After we'd finished dessert, Aunt Susan stood up and raised her glass, giving a final toast to our family and to those who came before us. The moment she sat down, the lights flickered and the room plunged into darkness. There were murmurs of confusion, some nervous laughter, and then Aunt Susan struck a match and lit a candle on the table. The dim glow cast eerie shadows across the room, and in the low light the mirror seemed darker, almost like a window into another room. As we sat there in silence, I noticed something shift in the mirror. It was faint, just a quick movement at the edge of the glass, but enough to make my heart race. I looked at Aunt Susan, who was staring into the mirror, her face pale. She whispered something under her breath, too quiet for anyone else to hear. Then, suddenly, the lights came back on, and the mirror returned to its normal reflection. Everyone relaxed, laughing about the ghostly power outage, but Aunt Susan looked shaken. She told us she'd had enough family history for the night, and suggested we all go into the living room for coffee and board games. As we moved into the next room, I stayed behind for a moment, unable to resist taking one last look at the mirror. I could swear there was something in the reflection that didn't belong. A shadowy figure, standing just behind where I'd been sitting, its face half hidden by the ornate carvings of the frame. I blinked, and it was gone, but the chill remained. That night, as we were getting ready to leave, Aunt Susan pulled me aside. She told me to keep quiet about what I'd seen, that some things were better left unspoken. She whispered that the mirror had a memory of its own, a connection to those who'd looked into it over the centuries, and that sometimes, just sometimes, the past might peek through. I left with a strange feeling that night, a mix of curiosity and fear. Thanksgiving at Aunt Susan's was never the same after that. She kept the mirror, but every year she draped a dark cloth over it, refusing to let anyone see their reflection. She said it was for tradition, a sign of respect for our ancestors, but I knew better. We all did. To this day, no one talks about the mirror. It's just an unspoken rule. But every Thanksgiving, when Aunt Susan places a cloth over that ancient, twisted frame, I feel a cold shiver, wondering who or what might be waiting on the other side, watching us as we gather around the table, celebrating a holiday meant to honor family, living or otherwise. There was something.